Hi, everyone. Good morning. I see we're live on Facebook, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Anita Lucchese, and I serve as Executive Director of Sovereign Bodies Institute. And it's my great pleasure to open up our webinar today. I think this is a really special webinar. It's a topic that's not talked about enough. Today, we're going to be hearing from Lenny Hayes on sexual violence against men and boys. And I just want to open up by saying that I think this issue is incredibly important. As a woman survivor, from survivor to survivor, every person who's experienced violence needs to be heard and have a seat at the table. And so that's what we're hoping to take part in today. And also, I can say that every man that ever abused me was also a victim of violence himself, and was lashing out towards me because he was traumatized by violence that he experienced, oftentimes sexual violence as a child. So this topic is incredibly important, not only to honor the victims of the violence, but also to honor the ripple effect of it and just how many people it can hurt when we don't create healing spaces and spaces for dialogue for our men and boys who have experienced violence. And I'm very happy that Lenny Hayes is going to be leading us through this topic. I know it's a hard thing to talk about, but he has such a wonderful way of doing it. And we're really honored that Lenny is here representing not only his own organization, Tate Topa Consulting, but also Sovereign Bodies Institute. Lenny works with us on our Two Spirit and LGBT initiatives, and also works as a counselor with some of the clients that come to SBI. So we're very fortunate to have Lenny as part of our team, and I'm very excited for him to share his expertise with us today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Lenny. Thank you, Lenny.
Thank you so much, Anita. I just adore you. Um, so good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Let me pull up my PowerPoint presentation. So again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure today to present on a topic that we don't talk about. We know that sexual violence happens within all communities across the country, but I am specifically will be talking about the Native male population because we know that this population is a population that doesn't get a lot of attention. Um, there's more work that needs to be done. And so me being a survivor, I have such passion to do this work, and I know that there is a lot of males out there who have healed, Native males who have healed from this, but yet are very fearful to come forward because of the stigma that we have on this topic. So I'm going to begin with, who am I? And we know that we do this in our tribal communities, or even when we're amongst other Native people. So who am I? My name is Tukan Luta, which means redstone ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes. I am a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am founder and owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. I'm a mental and chemical health therapist specializing in marriage family therapy. I'm an educator, I'm an advocate, I'm a motivational speaker, and I'm also what my culture, what my language says, I identify as a Winkta, which was a word that was given to me by my people, but I also identify as a Dakota Two-Spirit male. I am also a survivor of child sexual abuse and adult rape. I'm also a survivor of child mental, emotional, and physical abuse. I am also a survivor of the foster care system. So as part of the work that I do in presenting on this topic, one of the things that I would like to remind the audience is that if it gets too hard and gets too heavy, or maybe you are a survivor of sexual violence, I would really encourage you to take a step away from the presentation for a few minutes, because it's not my purpose here to bring reminders of your own sexual violence, but I'm reminding you of taking care of yourself because this stuff is really, really heavy. And I will be sharing bits and pieces of my own story. And I do that because I want people to understand like the mental health impact. What I don't want people to do is to feel sorry for me because that's not my point in doing this work, but helping people to understand. I am a survivor, and I thank the Creator for bringing me to this area in my life that I'm able to talk about this and share my own story. And there's so many different, so many similarities out there, but we all have different stories. So one of the questions that I like to ask when I do this PowerPoint presentation, but I also do a 6-hour training because I really want us to begin to have conversation about the impact of sexual violence on men and boys. And so as part of my training that I do, I like to ask these questions. And I want you to think about it for a few minutes. You don't have to answer, but I just want you to think about it. So how many of you know of a male, a boy or an adult, who has been impacted by sexual violence? If so, what were some of your struggles and challenges? How did you respond? So these are really important questions to ask yourself, because once we start to ask ourselves these questions, then we start to break down barriers. And this also allows us to begin to have conversation about sexual violence against men and boys. What I like to also do too is I like to show this picture, and I believe we all know what this picture of is. This is the Carlisle boarding school. We know that a lot of our children that went to Carlisle or any of the many boarding schools that were across the country, but originally this was the first boarding school. So we know that a lot of our children were abused, both physically, emotionally, mentally, and also sexually. We know that our priests and our nuns did terrible things to our children. And so the reason why I like to show this is because of the fact that if you think about historical to intergenerational trauma, males who have been impacted by, Native males who have been impacted by sexual violence have carried this from generation to generation. And so I like to show this too, because in a conversation that I had with one of my Native LGBTQ colleagues, we sat and looked at this picture one time, and the question came up was, statistics say today that 1 out of 10 individuals identify as LGBTQ or Two-Spirit. And so the question is, how many of those children in this picture do you think may have identified? I won't go too much into that because that's a whole different type of training, but if you think about Two-Spirit males who may identify as either bisexual, gay, or Two-Spirit, we know that before colonization, our Two-Spirit individuals were highly respected. And we also know that in some tribal communities, they actually had ceremonies or celebrations when a child came out. So when we had the discussion, the whole discussion was, do we ever think about that when we look at this picture? Because we know that we have some great, amazing Two-Spirit, or I have a lot of Two-Spirit amazing colleagues who are really doing important work across the country to bring beauty and acceptance back into tribal communities when it comes to this identity. But what I also don't like to do either is I don't like to put the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people in a box. Because the whole thing about talking about male sexual violence is that we need to begin to break the stigma, the misunderstanding of that it's individuals who identify are the only ones that get sexually abused. That is not true. So one of the things that I tell people is that I was born a Two-Spirit male. I was born a Winkta. So a lot of the sexual violence that I experienced as a child and as an adult, a young adult, does not define the sexual abuse that I went through as a child. No one deserves to be sexually abused or abused in any other way. So I like to share that, you know, because it's important for me to try to break down that stigma, because we know that there is Native heterosexual men out there who have been sexually abused, have not yet began to even heal from their own trauma. But we also have men out there who have healed, but they're still silenced because of the stigma. So to begin the PowerPoint, I like to, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because these are really heavy, but and I believe that all of us know these terms. We all know the understanding, but it's important to share them too. So what is sexual violence? Sexual violence is when a person uses tricks or power threats, and or use violence to have sexual contact with another adult. It is called rape or sexual assault. When the individual is a victim of a relative, we often use the phrase incest. When the child is a victim of an adult, it's often called child molestation. So it's really important to know these terms. So what is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse is sexual contact without consent. One of the things that I talk about and really stress is that children do not consent because they often do what adults tell them to do. You know, in my own experience in being a survivor of child sexual abuse, one of my most of the individuals that I was sexually abused from were family members. When I was being sexually abused at the age of 6, 7 years old, one of them had threatened me that if I told, that he would hurt me more. So that was his way of keeping me silent. So, but also too, I mean, I came from a very dysfunctional family where there was alcohol, there was drugs, there was a lot of physical abuse, a lot of emotional, sexual abuse that was happening in the home. So I really had no one to go and tell what was happening to me. And so when someone threatens you that they're going to hurt you and you're, you know, 5, 6, 7 years old, of course you're going to keep silent because of just the fear. So I wanted to share that with you. A child is affected by sexual abuse when he may question his ability to defend himself, or he may not trust his body to function in times of crisis. He may question his body and say, what did I do to invite this? He may begin to hate his body. He may begin to not respect his body or the surroundings around him. Often will begin to use alcohol, drugs, or over or undereat or smoke as a teen. Those are many of the things that I did as a young person who was impacted by sexual violence. One of the things that I talk about is, so being a ward of the court at the age of 10 and being removed, that was the beginning of my foster care system story. So before the age of 10, when I was experiencing so much trauma within the home, there was so much fear that I had. So one of the things I talk about is that because I was so fearful of many things that were going on around me, I often would wet the bed. And so when I would wet the bed, I was often beaten by my biological mother. So being a child, if you can think about trying to do the right thing as a young person. So for me, what I would often do is I would often hide the sheets. You know, in reality, when we think about that as an adult, we know that that's not any effective thing to do because the adult is going to know what you did. But for someone that was my experience of being a young person, I thought by hiding the sheets would be the right thing, but that doesn't often happen either. One of the things I also talk about too is that one of my perpetrators, both sexually, physically, mentally, and emotionally, was my biological mother. One of the things that I had a very difficult time working through, I went through 10 years of extensive therapy to heal from all of the trauma that I experienced, one of the most difficult was having to talk about what my mother did to me. Um, and I don't tell these stories because I am like lashing out at my mother, or anything like that. I haven't had a relationship with my biological mother for over 20 years, 23 years or longer. I haven't talked to her, but what I had to work through therapy was the most difficult thing, because I would tell my therapist stories of when my mother would get mad at me. We lived in poverty, and oftentimes I was bathed in the kitchen sink. And so when my mother would get mad at me, what she would often do is she would flick my penis or she would bite my butt cheeks. And so when I told the therapist these stories, my therapist said to me, she said, "Lenny, that's a form of sexual abuse." Um, my response to her was, "No, it's not." Um, and so it took me another good year to start to address my violence that I experienced from my own biological mother. So, and the reason why I tell that is because I've had the opportunity to travel across the country, go into tribal communities, and talk about sexual violence against men and boys. And one of them, one of my experiences that I like to talk about is that I was in New Mexico presenting on this topic, and presenting in front of 180 people. Um, and the next day, I had 4 men approach me. And these 4 men, Native men, approached me and disclosed to me that they were sexually abused. One of them went as far as telling me that he was sexually abused by his mother for 15 years. Um, and what I remember the most about those stories, and being able to talk with these men, is that all of them had a sense of relief on their face that someone was talking about it. So that's what I remember most. One of the things that we often don't talk about either is that often in our tribal communities, we have medicine people or spiritual people who are male, who are sexually violating boys and even men, and we don't talk about it. We know that it happens, to women and girls, because we hear those stories. And I was really impacted by an individual when I was doing this training, and he was with his wife. And one of the things that he spoke up about was, he said, "So what am I supposed to do? Tell me what I'm supposed to do when I go out in community." And he said, "My perpetrator was a spiritual person in the community. And when I see him, my rage goes to my neck." Um, and so at the time when I was doing the presentation, I couldn't stop and do therapy with him or suggest therapy. But one of the things that I said to him was that, I said, "I believe you." Um, because those are the things that we should say when someone comes to you and says, "This is what happened to me." We should never question um, the, the sexual abuse or any other form of abuse. And then one of the things I said to him was that I was happy that he didn't act on his rage. And the third piece was, I said to him, "I hope that you will find someone that you trust, that you'll be able to work through your trauma with." And those are the only things that I could say to him. So I wanted to share those stories, but also getting back to my own biological mother. I don't say these things to hurt. I bring truth to my own story, because one of the things that I say about my mother, my biological mother, I still love her. I love her because she gave birth to me. Um, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here today. But that is the only reason why I love her. One of the things that I say is that, my mother didn't teach me any good things. What she taught me to do was, she taught me how to survive with many of the different types of violence that I did against other people. So, I like to tell that story because I don't think that we also don't talk about that enough either. And again, I'm not doing this to hurt my biological mother, but I want to bring truth because I know that this happens within our community. A child is affected by sexual abuse when he disassociates as a child due to memories or reminders of abuse. Even after the abuse stops, the child may feel he's ineffective, powerless, and worthless. He has learned from being abused that what he does, wants, feels, or thinks makes no difference. He will continue to question himself, why did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why didn't I tell someone? And some of the other stuff that I wanted to share is that, through some research, we know that abused males report significantly higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and suicide. You know, in another research, they found that sexually abused boys were significantly more likely than non-abused boys to father a child, to have multiple sexual partners, and more than likely to have unprotected sexual intercourse as young people. So it's really important to know that, and to know really the impact of sexual violence on a young person. This is also another topic that we don't rarely ever speak of in community either, is that, boys can be sexually abused by a woman. And when a boy is being sexually abused by a woman, the boy faces confusion and isolation when he is sexually abused by a woman. A boy who talks about being abused by a woman is often greeted by disbelief, denial, trivializing, and romancing the story. So a lot of times, we hear men around us, adult males, heterosexual males, say, "Good job, you did the right thing," but in reality, what we're not really doing is listening to that individual who's trying to say, "I've been abused." And if any of the experience felt good, he wasn't abused. If he did not enjoy it, he must be gay. And again, that's where I'm talking about the stigma on this topic. Boys are more reluctant to disclose than girls, and children who are victims of a family perpetrator often delay disclosure longer than a non-family member. Did you also know that the losses that boys and men experience in their early years leave lifelong scars and pain? Boys who do not fit the traditional macho image are marginalized, ostracized, harassed, and physically punished. So when we talk about that specifically, one of the things that I like to talk about is that we think about our two-spirit, maybe our two-spirit bisexual or gay boys. If they don't fit that traditional macho image, they're the ones who are often bullied. And we say that bullying results in trauma. The trauma that males experience is lethal, large, and hard to work through. It is possible. And again, I like to stress that it is possible. It's painful to work through trauma, but one of the things I always say is that at the end of the road, when you work through all of it, it's such a beautiful feeling knowing, like for me, how much I healed from my trauma. Many men who have hurt others may have been hurt themselves. So what pieces of childhood does a sexually abused child lose? So one of the things that I like to say about this graphic is that I experienced almost every one of them. If not, I would say all of them I experienced. So the loss of memory of childhood. So if you think about it, the many different forms of trauma I experienced, one of the things that I get really sad about is the fact that I can't remember any good memories of my childhood. One of the things that I remember the most and I hold on to quite tightly is the fact that I love the smell of bacon. So every time I smell bacon, it reminds me of my grandmother. And the reason why it reminds me of my grandmother is that when I was part of the foster care system, I was able to go and spend a weekend with my grandmother. And I remember every Saturday morning, my grandmother would be cooking breakfast. And I remember, her making fry bread and cooking this huge breakfast. And I could still today hear her whistling as she was cooking. And so for me, that's a beautiful memory to hold on to. But the thing that I also really got frustrated with is that when I would talk to several of my siblings, we would talk about the trauma that we experienced as children. And two of my siblings would often say, well, do you remember when this happened? And a lot of times I couldn't remember. And so when I was in therapy, I would go into therapy and I would say, why can't I remember these things? And I would get really angry. And my therapist said to me, she said, Lenny, why do you want to remember those things? She said, your brain protected you. So it took me a long time to really understand that concept. And I understood more of that concept when I was studying to be a mental health provider. So I get it. So again, I still feel sad because I don't have a lot of good memories of my childhood. Loss of opportunity to play. When you grow up in a dysfunctional home where, again, like when there's a lot of abuse and a lot of alcohol, drugs, all of that going on, we often, or for me, my experience was that I was never often able to be a child. I was either taking care of my relatives or my parents when they were drinking, or I was taking care of my siblings. So I never had the opportunity to play. So in my work, I really stress when working with my relatives in a therapeutic setting, one of the things that I really talk about is healing that child within, because I know a lot of our adults haven't had that experience of healing that child within. So for me, even as an adult, when my little boy comes out and plays, I allow him to come out and play. It may be, one of the things that I like to do is I like to buy childlike cereal, like Captain Crunch or Fruit Loops. And for me, that's my way of nurturing my child. Often, sometimes I will get playful and be a child, and I allow my child to play, but also remembering too in the work that I do, nurturing my child within. I had an experience about a year ago where I had been doing so much work in regards to violence and all the many other different forms of violence and the work that I do in child welfare, sex and human trafficking, sexual abuse against men and boys, all of that work. And I had lashed out at an individual, and it really bothered me. So I came back to Minneapolis and I went into therapy because I wanted to address that. But one of the things that I do is that I always say, for me, the Western way of thinking has its way of, it helped me. But I also, through culture and spirituality, was another form of healing for me. And so I always like to, when I talk about the cultural and spiritual aspect, I will also make time and space to talk with an elder who gives me that perspective. And one of the things she said to me, she said, Lenny, she said, how are you taking care of your little boy? And I was like, well, what do you mean? She said, when you're up there presenting and talking about the many different forms of violence, she said, your little boy is standing beside you with his hands over his ears. And she said, that little boy is the one who was impacted by your child violence. And so she said, how are you taking care of him? So that really got me to thinking. So when I left her office, I went to the dollar store and I actually bought child-like coloring books and crayons. They weren't adult coloring books, they were child-like coloring books. And so a lot of times I will find myself sitting down and just coloring because that's a way of nurturing that little boy and allowing him to play. Loss of healthy and social contact. I didn't know what a healthy relationship was. Growing up and being a part of the many different forms of violence, being a survivor of the child of the foster care system, I didn't know what a healthy relationship was. So when, as a young adult, I went out and searched for relationships that were violent because that's all I knew and that's all I understood. So I didn't learn how to be in a healthy relationship until I was an adult, until I went through my healing journey. Loss of opportunity to learn, loss of controls in one's body. Again, going back to what I was talking about, wetting the bed. What I didn't say was that when I was removed from the home at the age of 10 and went into full-fledged foster care, I remember being removed from the home and going to a group home. One of the first things that I did when I woke up in that group home was I checked to see if I wet the bed. Um, I talk about that experience because I remember how happy I was that I didn't wet the bed, and I never did wet the bed again from there. Lots of normal, loving, nurturing environment. I didn't know what a loving environment was. Um, and there's many other different losses, but I like to share this, to help you to understand, you know, one of the things that I also talk about is that, males and females may experience the same kinds of trauma, but in reality, we don't process and respond the same to that trauma. And so it's really important to know that males don't respond like a female does. So I really wanted to stress that with you all. So here are some facts. 75 to 95% of offenders are known and may be related to the child. In development terms, young children cannot make up explicit sexual information. They must be exposed to it and speak of their own experiences. Sometimes parents will try to get the child to lie. One of the things that I talk about with my one of my siblings is that when we were children and we were growing up, seeing a lot of the violence where there was a lot of alcohol, I remember as a child, as a young child, seeing my mother being passed out and multiple men would take advantage of her. Today we would call that rape. As a child, I didn't understand that until I got into this work and went through my own healing to really understand that that is a form of sexual abuse. Um, Most child sexual abuse is perpetrated by men who are heterosexual. Often we think that men who perpetrate on males are gay, and that's not true. They do not find sex with other men at all attractive. So, one of the things to remember about violence is that it's all about power and control. That's one of the most important things to understand when we talk about violence. Children generally do not question the behavior of adults. They are often coerced with bribes, threats, and use of authority. Again, child abuse is an act of power. In a recent study of convicted child molesters, 80% were found to have committed their first offense before the age of 30. And you can find all this information in Abused Boys and Neglected Victim of Sexual Abuse, Nick Hunter. So now I'm going to begin to talk about adult males, the impact of child sexual abuse, as I just covered, what happens to a child who is impacted by sexual abuse. And so when this report came out, I was so very happy. This was a report that was specifically released by the National Institute of Justice and Research. And so this report was also on violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women. But what I loved about this research was that Native men were included in this research. So in this research, 1 in 4 American Indian and Alaska Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. More than 1 in 10 have experienced sexual violence with penetration. And overall, more than 475,000 American Indian and Alaska Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Now, with personally and professionally, in talking with a lot of individuals across the country, I believe that this data is much more higher because we have to think about the men and the boys who do not report. So again, I believe that this data is much more higher. So in this report, what I did was I broke down violence against men. So to your left, you see that there, in the left column, it's type of violence. The American Indian and Alaska Native is in the middle, and non-Hispanic white only. So if you look at the many different forms of violence that occurs on men, the American Indian and Alaska Native men is much more higher. Now, again, I want to stress that this report was only done specifically on Native men and not boys. So, but if you look at that, the rates of violence are much more higher. So it's very important that we understand this. So the second slide on the violence against men from this report is specifically the violence that men have experienced in the last year when they did this research and report. So again, the statistics for American Indians and Alaskan Natives is much more higher than the non-Hispanic white only column. So this gives you an idea, and again, we don't talk about, intimate partner violence because we only think that intimate partner violence happens to same-sex couples or same-sex males, but that is not true. Again, that's another topic that we don't talk about and that we need to talk about. So in my research also, I found out that we are 20 years behind in providing services for males who experience some form of sexual violence. So when you think about that, we think about in our tribal communities and with tribal coalitions or shelters across the country, a lot of these shelters do not provide services for males. And, we know that there is lack of data and research on this. Again, that was the only report that was ever done on Native American males in regards to violence of all forms. So we need more research. One of the things that I found out through my studying and researching specifically on this topic, a lot of the studies and research are done out of the country. One of the things that I came about was that the country Norway does excellent research in regards to violence against Native men and boys. So again, we need to advocate for more data and research. One of the things that I also talk about too is that we need to create a space so that we can do this work. And the only way that we're going to do this work is that we need to have the conversations. We need to open up the doors, and we need to realize too that if we're going to talk about healing our tribal communities, or healing our specifically our tribal community, we need to understand and know that when we talk about healing, that we allow healing of all genders. So, since I've been doing this work and started doing this work 10 years ago, I have seen traumatic growth, or I shouldn't say traumatic growth, but growth. Because I remember when I first came into doing this work, it was hard for me to go into a space because a lot of people didn't really accept me in that space. So it was a lot of determination to do this work and to help people to understand. So why do men wait to seek professional help? I think that's one of the questions we always ask when talking about this topic. Well, the abuse could still be too fresh. It may not yet been defined as abuse. And again, we may look at it as being abuse, but we also need that individual who has been impacted by the sexual abuse or sexual violence to define it for themselves. The perpetrator may still got you to keep silent. Again, think about the story I told of the adult male who told me about a spiritual leader in his community who was his abuser. So he is keeping silent. Fear, even though the abuse may be over, it can still feel dangerous. Even a dead perpetrator's presence can be felt strongly. The time and place may not be right to disclose. Again, we need to remember that we need to allow this individual to find the time and place to disclose. We can't just do it for them. The individual may not know he has options, feelings of being weak, battered, and hopeless to take action, self-blame and shame. So one of the things that, that I feel very, very passionate about is that given that the individual and society level of stigma, and again, I'm talking about the stigma about this topic, we also, need to include the prejudice, the stereotypes, the taboos, especially surrounding homosexuality in the U.S. Many male survivors experience unique issues related to fears of becoming or being seen as a potential perpetrator, fear of being perceived or labeled as gay, and a confusion about sexual identity that can lead to hypermasculinity and attempts to resort back to masculinity. So what I mean by that is that, um, often, men who are abused will often perpetrate violence or bullying on individuals who identify. I've known that to happen. I've seen it happen. Um, is that, you know, one of the things that I also know of too is that, you know, Native heterosexual men can often be very uncomfortable around individuals who identify, either bi or gay or two-spirit. They're often very uncomfortable around them because one of the things that they think is that every individual who identifies who's male is out to hook up with them or after them, and that's not true. You know, um, One of the things that I really encourage, and I'm really so glad to know this individual is Greg Cloud, and he's doing some amazing work with his equine therapy in talking about violence, that men do, just specifically all of this work. And I like to listen to him when he talks about masculinity because, you know, he says it like it is, if you know what I mean. And so my hope is that eventually, as we come forward and talk more about this topic, is that we will create a space for men to come forward and lead the work. My goal right now is to break down the stigma. My goal right now is to help people to understand the mental health issues that impacts males um, who are survivors of sexual violence. That is my work, but I also know that there's men out there who are doing great work when it comes to cultural and spiritual aspects of healing. So when I do this training in community, this is often where I like to create conversation. So men who are violent are often sent the messages as a child: be strong, be sexually active, be straight, be independent, don't ask for help, don't cry or show vulnerability, take control, be dominant. So these are a lot of things that we're told as young people, and we grow up thinking this way. When I do ask this question, when I'm doing a public training, um, almost every male that attends the training often agreed these are the things that they were taught. Um, and I like to have conversation about this because it just opens up more doors, for healing. Um, these are some of the frequent issues and problems faced by adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Again, I will say that when I look at this graphic, I have experienced every one of them. The anxiety, depression, I was diagnosed with PTSD. It was also the sexual violence, but the physical violence, the emotional, mental played a part in that. The low self-esteem, the guilt and shame, fear, um, become abusers or protectors. So when I look at that, one of the things that I discovered through my own healing, that I became a protector. Um, I am happy that I didn't become an abuser. I didn't sexually abuse anyone, but what I did was I discovered that because of the many different types of violence that I experienced, there was other ways that I abused, and one of them was verbally. Um, I have been with my partner for 10 years now. And in the beginning of our relationship, one of the things, I am like a total nerd. I love to read, I love to drink coffee, and I think a lot of my friends know that. And so I would hang out a lot at bookstores. And as I was walking down the aisle in a bookstore, there was this book that flew out at me. and I picked it up and looked at it, and it said the verbally abusive relationship. And I opened it up and I looked at the characteristics, and I said, "Oh my God, I'm doing this to my partner." So again, I went back into therapy, and I will often do that throughout my life. I understand that, I accept that, I know that. Um, but even today, I mean, I do go in and do mental health checkups, which I think is really important. But again, I stress the part of the cultural and spiritual aspects of healing, and having that connection with the elder is part of my healing process, healing journey. I do tell people that I don't believe that I will be fully healed, but I'm at a place where I am I'm comfortable, I'm well, um, I understand my own reminders of my past. I know how to cope and deal with them. So, but again, I don't ever think that I will be fully healed because of all the trauma that I experienced, and I'm okay with that. I'm happy where I'm at. Um, so these are frequent issues again that are faced by adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Does not know how to trust, and often what will happen too is we'll become over trusting. So one of the things that I know about myself is that um, I can be an over trusting person, but also what happens too is that if you break that trust, then what I do is I go inside of a shell, and the relationship will never be the same. So I'm still discovering how to work through things. Does not know how to communicate. I didn't know how to communicate with individuals, uh, family members, individuals that I may have had a relationship with, intimate relationships. But again, going back to what I said earlier, is that I only sought out um, relationships that were violent because that's all I understood, that's all I knew. Um, I've been, again, with my partner for almost 10 years. And one of the things that I say is that it's probably the most healthiest relationship I've ever been in, because I'm allowed to say no and not be fearful. Um, I'm allowed to say, I don't think that's right, and not have fear. So within this 10 years, I've learned to communicate with my partner, be able to talk with him. Alcohol and drugs. I had my foot in the door of becoming an alcoholic. I um, do not identify as an alcoholic, but I identify as a person who abused alcohol. Because when I gave up alcohol 7 years ago, I went into ceremony because for me, that was a way of healing. One of the things that the reasons why I did it too was because I was also doing a lot of Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ work, and I thought, if I'm trying to promote healing within my own community, I wouldn't be a very good role model if I'm hanging out with individuals in the bars. Granted, I do go out with my partner every now and then. I don't drink, but we still communicate. Like if he wants to go to the bar, my partner doesn't have issues with alcohol. And when he wants to go, I will go with him, but we have an agreement that after 2 hours, then we would leave, so we compromised, we talked about it. Confusion, does not know how to love. Again, that's what I experienced. I didn't know how to love. I didn't even know how to love myself. Um, Granted, trying to love someone, you know, and thinking that the violence that I experienced was love, and it wasn't. Social isolation. Um, so there's many other different types of issues that impacts adult survivors of child sexual abuse. I just wanted to give you a number of them to sort of think about, and understanding. Um, it's important to know that not all issues and problems are the same with adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Each individual is different with similarities. So it's really important to know that, because what I don't want people to do is to put labels on individuals. What I want people to do is to understand the impact of sexual violence on males. And again, really stressing that not all issues and problems are the same. We're all different. So what I'm going to go into now is some recommendations. These are just some ideas. These are some of the things that I, specifically talked with other people, but even just my own research on understanding and specifically talking about Native community. So we need to ask that question. How do we help men and boys heal? Well, we need to create a safe place so that they can tell their story. Um, we need to show compassion. One of the things that I carry with me as a two-spirit male, and I really have this notion that when I sit with elders, any elders, two-spirit elders, our Native women and men elders, one of the things though that I really carry with me is what a Dakota two-spirit woman said to me. She said, if you don't have compassion, you have nothing at all. So in the work that I do, both nationally, locally, when working with people in my private practice, I always think of that because, it's important to have compassion, especially to sort of sit with people when they tell these very hard stories of themselves. We need to create compassion. We need to create empathy. We need to break down the stigma. Um, we need to educate and bring awareness. We need to encourage and support to discuss. So, the things that we really need when talking about how we can help men and boys heal, we need that continued increased awareness for trauma-informed and gender-responsive approaches with male survivors of sexual abuse. We need adequate attention to gender roles. We need safe, supportive, and empowering environments. We need male-specific sexual abuse advocates work. We need more outreach. We need more training. And one of the most important things too is that we need to challenge and confront homophobia. Because if we continue to have homophobia, we are not going to create space for even healing for males and boys who may identify as either bisexual or gay or Native or two-spirit. We're not going to create spaces like that if we don't challenge homophobia. So I wanted to share that with you. So we need to change the way we talk and think about individuals who experience child sexual abuse. Sometimes we don't even talk about it. So again, we need to begin to have these conversations so that we can create healing, help create healing for men and boys. We need to remember that not all victims of child sexual abuse become abusers, because that's one of the things that we talk about, is that we always think that every individual, both male or female, who have been impacted by sexual violence are going to be perpetrators. That is not true, but there's a possibility that they can become perpetrators. So we need to remember that instead of just automatically thinking that that person is going to become an abuser. Because when we think that way, then we also prevent individuals who are survivors of sexual violence to come forward to talk about their truth, to talk about their own healing. And I think that's one of the reasons why, a lot of men don't come forward, because of many of these fears. That's why we have a lot of men who don't come forward and help with the work, because they're fearful. They have labels. So for me, doing this work has really, I was fearful. I was scared when I started doing this work, and I specifically talk about one organization or one, what happened to me was that I had a individual from the Me Too movement contact me. She was a lawyer, and I got fearful because at that time, that's when a lot of these charges against these white men that were um, promoting or creating or doing violence against women was coming out, and I was really fearful. So what I said to her, which stopped the conversation, was I said, the work that I do specifically on sexual violence against men and boys is I'm talking about the Native population. Because again, this is a population that doesn't get a lot of attention. Um, and it doesn't get a lot of attention because we don't talk about it. Um, so again, I'm going to go back to how do we help men and boys heal? So we talk about the sweat lodge and ceremony. Um, I didn't grow up in ceremony. I didn't grow up in traditional ways of thinking because of, just being going from home to home, group home, being a part of the boarding school, um, you know, and then being emancipated by the tribal court system at the age of 17 and basically was told, you're an adult, get out, you got to take care of yourself, and never having that space of healing. One of the things I remember about my childhood too also is that because of my identity, um, I didn't have a good way of healing as a child. There was no space that was created for me because, I was forced to see a psychologist. And one of the things that I remember is that psychologist was more interested in changing my identity as a young gay boy rather than to help me to work through my trauma. So again, I carried all of this trauma throughout my life. And it wasn't until when I was 29 years old that I made a decision to go into therapy. At that time, I had a suicide attempt, but that was not even my healing, my point of healing. My point of healing was that I moved to the cities over 20 years ago, 23, 24 years ago. And I met this individual who was a good friend of mine. He was not my partner. There was no sexual contact, anything at all. It was a friendship. And one of the things that he said to me was that he was tired of me taking him on an emotional roller coaster ride and can and would not invest in our friendship anymore. That was my wake up call. That's what led me to therapy because it helped me to understand that there was someone who actually loved me, cared enough about me to try to help me, but also made the choice to step away from our friendship. Um, so that was my wake up call. Um, so what brought me to the part of the sweat lodge and ceremony is that it was a two-spirit woman, a Dakota two-spirit woman, who took me into my first sweat lodge. She taught me how to carry the rocks into the sweat lodge. She taught me how to tend to the fire. She taught me my Dakota values. She taught me how to carry myself, to think about my values and helping others. So I give a lot of credit to this Dakota Sioux woman who took me into my first sweat lodge and introduced me to the culture and spiritual aspect of our people. And that was a healing, great, tremendous healing experience for me. Last September, I experienced having my Indian name given to me. That was the healing component. So one of the things that I talk about, so ever since that experience, I feel like my life is in a circle now. I don't feel like there's pieces missing. I feel like a whole person, and I haven't felt like this in all of my life. And I'm 51 years old, and I'm glad that was able to experience that. I'm happy to have a connection to elders in the community, um, elders who are willing to help me, um, reminding me of things. So the sweat lodge and ceremony can play a big part in healing. Support groups, you know, one of the things that we need to do within our tribal communities is like, are we willing to hang posters up in our public places about issues of sexual violence against men and boys? Are we willing to show that? Are we willing to like reach out to somebody in our community who may be a survivor and able to help the community to begin to have conversation about sexual violence against males, helping them to lead in that work. Often sometimes we have individuals who may not identify as male, but yet they're trying to do the work. We need to let men lead the work, right? um, Increase funding for tribal programs. We can't do this work if we don't have money to do this work, right? So, we need the people in our tribal communities who run these programs to be able to be willing to apply for this funding, to create, healing within communities. So there's a lot of factors in how we help men and boys heal. So again, these are just some recommendations. They're not something that is solid. I like to show this so that we can begin to have conversation about how do we help men and boys heal. Um, so with that, I believe we are going to open it up with any questions or comments. I want to thank you all for attending this presentation on sexual violence against men and boys. And again, one of the things that if you're looking, once we get past this COVID, if you're looking for someone to come into your community to talk about sexual violence against men and boys, please reach out. Um, I'm hoping that I and Greg will be able to do some work in the future together, because I think that him and I can become a great team in talking about sexual violence against men and boys. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm just going to open it up now.
Well, thank you so much, Lenny. This was a really great presentation and really well. Definitely something that needs to be discussed. So we really appreciate you doing this here at SBI. Looks like you had such a great and thorough presentation. We haven't had any questions come up quite yet. But if any of you who are listening to our live stream on Facebook have questions, feel free to post them in the comments and we will discuss. So I guess one question I have for you, Lenny, is how can people contact you if they would like to set up a training in their community from you?
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the beginning of the um, presentation. So here's my contact information. And I believe sovereign bodies will also be putting this recording on their website. So there is my contact information if you are interested or just want to have a conversation. If you're nervous about asking a question that you may not want to ask publicly, please contact me.
Mm. We did have one question asking, what is a sweat lodge ceremony?
Um, well, I don't want to go too much into it. So, in some of our tribal communities, we have many different forms of ways that we do ceremony. And um, I am not one to really answer that question because I'm still learning and growing about what ceremony is. So um, that's really difficult for me to answer, but it is part of our traditional healing. Um, as a Dakota Sioux person or a Sioux person, because I know we do sweat lodges throughout the Great Sioux Nation. So I just want to be respectful on that piece. So I don't want to say what I don't know either, but I just know that it's been a part of my own healing. It's a ceremony.
Yeah, definitely. There's one question of, have you been to Alaska to give any of these presentations before?
No, I haven't, and I would love to. Because I've had conversations with several individuals from Alaska, and their communities have been impacted by sexual violence, and I know that there's a need. Um, for some training on this, and I would love to come in and do it.
Awesome. Lenny, have you ever helped develop curriculum in male engagement groups?
No, and I would also love to do that. So again, when I talk about this, you know, as long as I've been doing this work for 3 or 4 years, we're still having these conversations. I know that there's a lot of tribal communities out there who have not even yet begun to have this conversation about sexual violence against males because of stigma. But one of the things that I know of, you know, in doing this work too, you know, we really need to address because, you know, males who are impacted by sexual violence, there is high statistics of suicide. And a lot of that doesn't come out until afterwards. You know, I've had conversations with families who knew that their male relative was sexually abused, but it was never ever talked about. And it didn't come out until later. And that's the sad part about it, because we haven't even created healing for these men to heal.
Yeah, another question we got was, how do you deal with triggers?
Oh my gosh. Well, okay. If you want to if you want to specifically talk about, when we talk about culture and we talk about Native spirituality, one of the things that I have done for myself is that I've stepped away from a lot of that Western language. When I was in Arizona presenting on this topic, I had an elder woman come to me after the presentation, and she thanked me, um, you know, for giving this presentation, because she said, we know that this really impacts a lot of our tribal communities. And she said, can I share something with you, share some advice with you? And I said, sure. She said, I want you to stop using that word trigger. And I was like, okay. She said, say trigger. So I said, trigger. She said, what does that sound like? She said, the word trigger is a negative, powerful word. And she said, we as Indian people, she said, we believe everything has a spirit, the rocks, the trees, the grass. She said, even our feelings, our emotions, those are spirits, she said. So when you have sadness, anger, frustration, worry, all those negative feelings, when they come to you, those are spirits. And so she said, and rather than calling them a trigger, we need to call them a spirit. So for me, after I really thought about that concept and really thought hard about it, one of the things that I do for myself is that I never use the word trigger. I always say I'm having a reminder, because I will have reminders of my past violence. It may be through a book, it may be through a movie. So one of the things that I do for myself is that I try to use the word reminder, because again, you know, trigger is a negative, powerful Western word. Reminder is a culturally appropriate word to say, because for me, in my own experience, I believe that when we use that Western language, for me, if I use that Western language, I will stay stuck. So I say reminder, because that, you know, that's such a more gentler process. And I'm not telling people that they have to use that word, but for me, that's part of, I use that in my work for myself, because I know what it feels like when I have a reminder of my past. You know, again, like I said, a book or a movie can cause me to get a reminder of the violence that I experienced, but I try to take care of my spirit. That's one of the most important things. So that's what I like to share about the word trigger. But again, you know, using our medicines also helps with, for me, you know, it's very important for me that when I talk about this stuff that I smudge myself. I use my medicines to help me get through this stuff, because I remember at one time when I first started doing this work, um, I often became very teary-eyed when I would present, or I would cry. And again, there was an elder woman who came to me at a presentation because, you know, this organization wanted me to talk about my healing experience. And what happened was, when I was talking about it, I became very teary-eyed, and I had to stop and I had to take a breath. And I remember this elder coming up to me, this elder woman, and she had a ball of sage rolled up in her hand, and she opened up my hand and put that medicine in the palm of my hand and closed my hand and said, "This will help you." Um, so as I held it, I took a really deep breath, and then I let my air out, and then I continued. I do that every time I go out and do this work. I carry the medicine. It's either in my hand or it's in my pocket, and I hold it tightly because I know and understand that our medicines are powerful and that our medicines are healing. Our medicines give strength and courage. And so those are the things that I use to help myself when doing this work. So I hope that was helpful. I know I talked a lot.
No, that was really great. And there's a couple comments in here, really kind of affirming that, you know, they never really identified with the term trigger. So it's just really validating to hear you kind of give that, you know, kind of analysis of why they might have been feeling that way. So we had another question comment says from Scotty says, "Hello, Lenny. I believe that this is a topic is a great need. A lot of people sweep it under the rug, and I'm tired of the time and place and the hush hush. I think posters are a great way to spread awareness. Thank you for that. My question is, are there trainings and fundings for advocacy on violence against men and boys? If not, how do we start getting this movement into motion?"
Well, again, that goes back to, there is not a lot of funding out there. From my understanding that I heard from a colleague over a year ago, that there was federal funding to do this work. The sad part about it is that a lot of the tribal communities didn't apply for that money. There is federal funding, and so I would really encourage programs, or if you're part of a program or whatever, to take a look at that, to look for that funding, because there is funding. My hope is that, you know, nationally, I'll be able to have conversations with some of the federal agencies about how we can go about creating this work. And again, you know, we have to think about, you know, inviting men who are survivors, who have healed, to be a part of this work, to lead this work. But I hope that it changes. I'm beginning to have conversations with a federal agency, actually. So I am going to stress that, because again, you know, we need to provide opportunity for all genders in our tribal community to heal, which includes, you know, women, girls, men, boys, our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people. We need to create space for them to heal, because
Mhm.
that's just specifically, that's what our culture teaches, you know. Um, and I just believe that when we have that opportunity, we become such stronger communities.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really amazing how much of a protective factor that culture really is. And it seems that, you know, a lot of these issues that we're facing are because we had our cultures taken from us, whether that was through boarding schools or a lot of other different policies. So it makes perfect sense that, like, with the culture being removed from us, causing all this trauma, that it would be the culture that's also going to bring us back and help us heal from these issues.
Mhm.
So another question from Karina, she asks, are the statistics that were presented similar to Canadian stats? Are you aware of any organizations in Canada that are gathering this type of data?
Um, I am not affiliated or know of any organizations in Canada that are doing this work, so I don't know the statistics. I only just know what what has been done here in the United States. And again, like when I was given this information, I was so extremely happy because that is what we're missing more of here in the United States, is that data and research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly seems like a pretty big gap in the data for sure when it comes to this issue. So we're coming to the end of the questions that have been asked so far. So again, I'll put in another plug for anyone watching that would like to ask a question. Please comment on the Facebook feed. Oh, now we got one. Lenny, can you talk about how this work relates to decolonization?
Oh my gosh, that's like a very broad question. You know, and I think a lot of people who know me know that I do a lot of work in regards to Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people. So when we think about decolonizing our way of thinking, for me specifically, this is what I do. And so this is just an example. So when I present myself, one of the things that I say is that I am a Winkta. That was the word that was given to me by my people. That's who I am. Second, I will identify as a two-spirit male because, you know, for me, the term two-spirit didn't come about until 1990. That was a concept that was created by Native people and should only be used by Native people who identify. And then lastly, I will identify as a gay male. So coming from the reservation 24 years ago, I called myself a gay male because nobody taught me about what it meant to be a Winkta. So it was a derogatory term that was used against me. So for me, it was very shameful. And so through my healing journey, through understanding what it means to be two-spirit, it has also helped me to change or decolonize my way of thinking. So I embrace the term Winkta, even though it was a derogatory term that was used against me growing up. So what you're asking is, you know, is something I can't answer because, again, we haven't done enough work in our tribal communities in regards to sexual violence against men and boys. You know, one of the things that I really stress too in doing this work is that, you know, I know that sometimes our advocates who are female have a really hard time working with males who may experience some form of sexual violence. Because, you know, because of our own biases. So we need to like keep ourselves in check. We need to like explore our reasons why we feel uncomfortable helping a male. Because if we don't, we're not going to give that proper service to um, survivors who are male. Um, so that question again is such a broad question. Um, I I don't feel very confident in answering that, but it can only give you my own experience.
Yeah, thank you. Someone else asked, you mentioned someone you had heard speak that spoke frankly about masculinity. Could you say again who that was? I would love to read some of their work.
I don't know if he has any work written out there, but he is located in South Dakota and he does have an organization. His name is Great Gray Cloud. Um, yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. So another question, not posted here, but so what is one way that you would recommend to loved ones of someone who's, you know, been sexually exploited as a boy? What's the best way that a loved one can really stand there and be there for this person and support them? If you had to give a person like that advice, what would that be?
Well, first of all, like, you know, what I said earlier is just ensuring that male that you believe them. Because a lot of times there's always that question or the trivialization of, you know, what that person is telling you, the young person, um, you know, and do it without judgment. One of the things that, you know, I think is really important when it comes to adult males who are impacted, you know, sometimes we always think that we have the answers for them, and sometimes we always try to solve the problem for them. What we should be really asking them too is like, what can I do for you? How can I help you? Um, because it is difficult. It's very shameful to talk about sexual violence. You know, one of the things that I talk about as a gay male or as a two-spirit male, when I came to the cities 20 years ago, um, and being a survivor of the many different forms of violence, one of the things that I was introduced to when I came to Minneapolis was the gay websites. And what happened was I did meet an individual online, um, talked to him for about a month. We ended up going out to dinner. We ended up going to the club, and I ended up inviting him home with me. Um, and he perpetrated violence on me. He raped me. Um, he physically harmed me. He bit me. I had choke, you know, from his hand, the mark around my neck that was bruised. And I got away from him in my home. I locked myself in a bathroom, and he left. And then I went and woke up my roommate. And my roommate told me to call the police, and I refused to call the police because I was fearful of how I was going to be treated by the police. And then I also blamed myself. It was my fault because I invited him back to my home. I didn't understand that. So, you know, it's really like understanding and being very compassionate and just presenting a lot of empathy when individuals come to you and say, this is what happened to me. Um, we need more training. And again, we need to check our biases when we're doing this work because, you know, if we have biases against males who are impacted by sexual violence, then we're not going to provide them with the proper services that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we got another question here from John. He says, in your experience, what was your best approach in assisting a straight male who wants to talk about his sexual/violent abuse? For myself, being a two-spirit, many straight males have trusted me and opened up about their sexual, physical, and emotional abuse to me. Most of the times I get weak and afraid, but I listen. Is there an online resource that they can read about this subject?
No, there's not. There's not. But one of the things that I really try to stress in doing this work too, and again, that's why I don't like to put males who identify as bisexual or gay or two-spirit, I don't like putting them in a box because when we do that, then what we do is that the things that I say about my own experience with sexual violence is that I am a male who was impacted by sexual violence. My identity as a two-spirit or my identity as a winkta has nothing to do with that. So we need to sort of begin to break down those stigmas. Um, I feel honored that I've had heterosexual men come to me, native heterosexual men, and talk to me. My identity doesn't have nothing to do with that. It's just, you know, we don't talk about this, and I think there's just that sense of relief that a male is talking about it. You know, that's what I remember of all the males that I have come in contact with. Just that sense of relief because you can only imagine, you know, how long these individuals have carried it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our webinar here today. Just really lift my hands and thank you so much, Lenny, for this important discussion. It's really important to raise this awareness on this issue to help stop that cycle of violence because we know that hurt people, but healed people heal people. So that's really what we're trying to do here at Sovereign Bodies Institute. This recording will be available on our Facebook page and also on our website. So I just really encourage you all to take care of yourselves. This is a topic that's full of lots of reminders of abuse that individuals might have faced. We've posted a few of the hotlines in the comments for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, and the RAIN Helpline as well. So please use those resources if you need it, and also just stay tuned of what we're doing here at Sovereign Bodies, because we're looking forward to expanding this work. So as we close here, Lenny, is there any kind of final thoughts, takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with?
Um, just thank you for attending, and I hope that all of you are able to start having this conversation. Um, it's very difficult, and I too really want to express taking care of yourself. One of the things that I would, with our Native community is to make sure that you smudge yourself because this stuff is heavy. I shared a lot of my own story, and you may know of a relative or a friend who's male who has been sexually, impacted by violence. Just take care of your spirits.
Mm,
Thank you.
awesome. Thanks. Well, we'll see you all next time.